everyone, it's Cam here, welcoming you to another episode of The Build Room. In this week's episode, we're working back on Violet Crumbles and giving that rear end some love. So stick around and check it out. All right, so I'm feeling good about getting back to work on the RA23 in this episode. And as you can see, we've got a whole bunch of parts here that are all going into that rear end. Now the diff in Violet Crumbles actually looked like it was in pretty good nick when I got the car. It wasn't leaking any oil, it wasn't making any weird noises. So I'm not gonna go in and tear that apart. I'm not particularly familiar with the process of pulling those apart. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it to some degree. And my experience with diffs on the 23 is they usually run pretty well without much maintenance until you put too much power through them and then they just go pop. So instead, we're just gonna focus on the easily serviceable items. So basically, we're just gonna pull off the drums. We're gonna put new wheel cylinders in. We also have new brake shoes, new drums themselves, so they'll be going on. We also have some new brake lines and handbrake cables. All I'm gonna be doing is putting those things in, giving the diff itself a Dulux reconditioning, and then making sure that the handbrake cables and things like that are moving freely, adjust the shoes, and then it should be good to go back in the car once we've got the control arm bushes in and those ready to go, and we've run through and undercoated the bottom of that car, which I haven't done yet, and I'm kind of procrastinating on that one because I'm really not looking forward to doing it without a lift. Okay, so the diff has been sitting out in the elements for a while, so it definitely needs a good cleanup. It also unfortunately got knocked off the jack stands, or I knocked it off the jack stands at one point. I was carrying an esky out to a car for a mate's bucks night, so Dave, if you're watching, this one's for you, buddy. I am gonna have to panel beat somewhat the edge of the drum, otherwise these ones are not gonna go back on. The rear dust housing basically on that drum is bent up in one corner, so we'll have to knock that down, clean the diff up, and then we'll be ready to basically disassemble it and then paint as we go on the reassembly. The reason I'm not painting it all to start with is A, there's a lot of componentry in the way that has to come off before we can paint it, and B, it's so big and heavy, while I'm trying to put this thing together and work on it, I'm bound to scratch it up in different bits and pieces like that. So I'd rather be able to paint it as one of the last things I do and then put it aside somewhere on some towels so that once I put it back in, it should be protected for years to come. So enough talking, let's get out there and get it cleaned up. Cue the montage. Okay, so we're back in the garage. Unfortunately, we got rained out, so I wasn't expecting it, but we had a couple of days of stormy weather come through. I've actually been stripping the paint on this over a couple of days. Basically, after work each day, I do a couple of hours on it and then come out on the next one. So I did get all the paint off. I didn't get to the point that I wanted to, which was to have it rust converted and then wax and grease removed and basically ready to go when I brought it in. But that's fine. It's got a fair bit of just superficial surface rust that'll come straight off the second we touch it with rust converter. So yeah, not too worried about that. So in terms of removing the paint, I did try a couple of different things there. I tried these brass wire brushes that just go on the end of the drill. I tried some paint stripper, just some standard stuff from the local home supply store. And I also tried sandblasting. Basically, I would rate them as certainly the best and quickest and easiest, if you can get access, are these brushes. They're quick and easy to use and they just pull paint off with pretty little fuss. The chemical stripping is really messy and I find that you never get anything in one coat. I am going to try a bunch of different strippers at some point. I'm going to do a shootout actually, so hopefully people will be interested in that because there are different chemicals now in different strippers and some are more efficient than others. And from what I understand, they banned all of the really good chemicals because they were probably going to kill everyone. Yeah, paint stripping is a little bit different than what it used to be. And then finally with sandblasting, I've struggled to find a reliable sandblasting setup that will work on a home compressor because you're kind of limited by a standard single phase power outlet. If you've got 3-phase at your house, you're probably in better shape than me, but I don't. So I'm running on single phase, which means I've got a 15 amp, 2.5 horsepower compressor, and it just doesn't flow enough air to reliably sandblast anything big. It's also extremely messy. So I did this outside, I did it on a still day and I still had to wear obviously a respirator and all those sorts of things, but there was dust everywhere when I finished and it took a lot of cleaning just on the small parts. And really it was only good for sort of spotting in inside brackets and things like that. So certainly my number one pick would just be bearing with those brass brushes, unless you can get access to a full sandblasting area, in which case sandblasting is definitely the way to go if you can keep the mess somewhere else and you have good equipment. Now it's on to pulling apart the brakes. Okay, so the first thing that you're gonna have to do at home to service these is to remove the drums. Now I've already got the drums off. I showed you that in the previous episode. It was an absolute nightmare for me because even with these pads fully backed off, it was seized around this top area here. See, it's quite rusty here. I mean, it has been out in the rain, but it was just as rusty and solid when I was trying to remove these from the car. So there's a couple of things. Firstly, yes, you are probably going to end up with putting some penetrating fluid and stuff around here to try and loosen this up. The other thing that can catch you out is the automatic adjustment mechanism. So just below the brake cylinder, there is an adjustment arm which the handbrake attaches to. And basically it has a toothed wheel that will automatically tighten up the shoes against the inside of the drums as they wear. And that is generally speaking a one-way movement. There is a small toothed wheel with a spring catch on it, and you can access that via a hole on the back of the drum. And what you need to do is basically put a long screwdriver in to lever the retaining mechanism up and out of the way of the adjustment wheel. And once you do that, you'll be able to move the toothed wheel in the wrong direction so that you actually wind that bolt in. And once we have this apart, I'll show you that in a little bit more detail. But basically, the first thing you should do is back these off so the drums aren't rubbing against it and holding it still. If your drums move freely from side to side, you should be okay. If the drums, if they've seized locked, then you get a problem. My drums would freely move in terms of the movement of the car. They weren't seized that way, but they were seized around this ring. So step one is to remove the shoe return springs. Now, the top spring is there. The second spring is on the bottom. And we're basically just going to put a set of vice grips on them. Push them out. And pop them out of the way. You can just leave that loose in there. You can't really get to the other end of it for now. Then we'll remove the bottom spring, same way, set of vice grips. Got it locked on. Just lever it out. Remove that one because it comes out easy. Okay, so we'll take out the retaining clip now on this shoe. All you need to do is push down the front of the clip first, and then with the set of needle nose pliers, you can just twist the retaining pin 90 degrees and let the whole shooting match go, and it'll come right off. Then you can take the shoe out. And that gives us access to the handbrake assembly, including the adjustments mechanism up here that I was talking about before. Okay, so now we can take the rest of the return spring out, and that part of the adjustment mechanism has come apart. That's fine. We'll just put that to the side. The handbrake mechanism here is quite tight on here, so we're not going to bother trying to remove this just yet. You can try and push it out, but it's easier just to remove the retaining pin here. And then once you can move this whole mechanism, the handbrake cable will come out quite easily. So again, retaining pin out. Let's try and not drop it. And then with it slackened off, it's easy just to push the drum in a little bit so you've got some slack. Then you can wrestle this cable free. Like I said, it's a little bit tight, but now you can get the shoe out. Okay, and then we can see the shoe here. If we flip it over, there is a spring and a circlip. We'll take the spring out first, and then we'll just knock the circlip out, and the adjustment mechanism will fall away from the shoe, and we can swap it over to the new one. Spring off. Circlip out. And that whole assembly. So that's the end of the adjustment winder there. Will just come out, can be a little tight. Then we take the spring out. And we're good to go. These old pads weren't too bad in terms of their thickness either, but you know, we're replacing everything. Okay, so now to get the handbrake off, we've got the handbrake cable here, and we should loosen that up first from this carrier. It sort of locks into that carrier, so just lever it out. Okay, you don't have to get it all the way past this pin, but just so that it's loose. And that way, if you watch this carrier here, I can twist it from the bottom. And what I'm going to do is move it to a place. There's 3 tabs on here that I've got to basically compress in while I pull the handbrake cable out. So to do it with one person, just rotate it around until you can get easy access to all 3 pins. Take the hardest one first. And before we get to the other one that's going to be, then we'll take the next hardest. Then we'll take the hardest one. We'll be able to twist it around. And it's just one final clip, which is hard to do without blocking the camera. But I'll swap hands. Push this final clip in. Push this final clip in. And it's going to come through. All right. Give it a wiggle and we are out. All done. So the last thing we need to take out is the brake cylinder here. There's basically 2 10mm bolts on the underside. Take them out and this will just come straight out the top. And then that one will just come out nice and easy. And again, this one wasn't in bad condition. I mean, it is rusty from being out in the elements, and I did that with the drums off. They were looking a fair bit cleaner. So I would say that the drums were probably overhauled at some point recently before I bought the car, but better to be safe than sorry. And that's it. We're not going to break it down any further than that. We can see the axles spinning quite freely. There's nothing here other than dirt and grime. So I'm going to go and strip the paint and all the grease off this now, and then we'll give it a coat of paint. But to do that, we need a montage.
We're gonna need a montage.
Okay, so it's the next day. The paint has had plenty of time to dry now, so hopefully we can get everything back in without scratching it. And realistically, this is going to be pretty easy. We're just going to do everything in reverse order, and there's really only a couple of gotchas that I'll explain as we go. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is put the brake cylinder in. That's number one. Just drop that back in through the top. Make sure the screw holes are aligned with the Mickey Mouse ears. Then it's just the two 10mm screws in the bottom. Okay, so that's nice and tight. I'm feeling good there. And now we put the handbrake cable in. Okay, so we have the new handbrake cable here with the three-pointed section on it. And we're just going to feed that up through the old hole. Now you can pull the sprung section through just on some additional cable to get it out of the way for now. We just put it through the first of the clips that locate it later. And then we're just pushing the barb section through the original hole until it clicks in place. And then once you've got it in place, you just want to use a screwdriver just to bend those tabs out ever so slightly, not too much, because otherwise they won't hold it in as tight as it should. But you just want to make sure that all three are sitting on the base plate metal and stopping it from coming out in any direction. So we're nice and secure there. Okay, so now we can feed the handbrake cable back down to the bottom of the spring. Don't tuck it into this bracket yet, because it'll be much easier to get it attached to the adjustment mechanism while it's loose, and then we can tuck it back in when we're done. Okay, so now we need to mount the adjusting arm into the brake pad. If you remember, we pulled that circlip off before, so they came apart. Now, these are aftermarket shoes, and I know that the mounting hole is actually too tight. So yeah, it's an 8mm pin. That should be an 8mm hole, but I don't know whether it's this coating that they dip it in or whatever, but it just doesn't allow you to get it through it. So I'm just going to drill it out. We don't want to take a lot out. We still want a good tight fit. But yep, all right, that's enough to get us through. All right, so we're doing the left-hand side of the diff. This arm goes on the trailing or the rear side of the drum. So This is the bottom of the shoe. This is the top of the shoe. We're just going to pop that through and flip it over and knock this pin back into place. Now this is probably going to be a little bit of a pain. We'll see. Okay, just get it started by hand, and then usually with a hammer, just knock it into place. Just being careful not to damage the actual shoe itself. All right, that was easy. Okay, so that's seated well. We've got plenty of movement there. Now we need to fix the adjustment mechanism into it. Now, this screw section here, you want to make sure that you do this all the way up, so it's the shortest rod possible to start with, because obviously the pads have got the most meat on them. Same with the inside of the drums, they've got the most metal on them, so that's when everything's going to be tightest right now when we're putting new stuff in. So if we were to leave this wound out, what would happen is the first position that these would be set in would be too wide. You'd never get the drums over them. So screw it all the way in. Then you put your cup on and this arm. And then what you need to do is just lift up this. It's pretty loose. It's not a bit of a problem. And you seat this section in here. So there's a cutout in the shoe itself. So there's a cutout in the shoe itself. We want to make sure that sits in there and it takes the handbrake arm at the same time. Okay, the notch here needs to point upwards, and then you just move that arm in over the top and lock it in place. So now any movement to this section here is going to move both the arms. So we can take this out for now and just put it to the side. Again, when we put it back in, just triple check that we don't have that wound out. And then we need to flip this over all as one unit and pop the return spring on this small arm, which we just loop backwards under here. And then with a set of needle nose pliers, we should be able to just stretch it over that arm. Okay, have all those pieces together. You can see the arm moves out and retracts automatically because of the spring. We can move this top one on its own as well. And the mounting point for that rod is nice and securely in place. So this is now ready to go back into the drum assembly. Okay, so for the handbrake, we can just pull the cable out a bit. That'll give us plenty to work with. Just slide it into the carrier, and as we pull the cable back through to the bottom, it's going to tighten up. And then we can locate the pad inside the drum, and at the same time, we can get this sprung cable protector located finally into that clip. All right, so now that's nice and secure. Pad sitting where we need it. And then we need to put the retaining pin through the bottom of the drum, and then just pop that spring clip back over the top. Pop it over and press it down. And if we're really lucky, we'll just be able to move the spring clip with our finger from the bottom to get it to catch. Okay, and then we can break out the needle nose pliers just to get at the last little bit. We're good to go, sitting at the 90 inside that groove, nice and neat. And the pad is retained now. It can still move around, obviously it needs to move for the brakes to work, but this shoe will be able to just move slightly so you can get it into position. Right, and then from here, the first thing that I like to do is to get our return spring back in, this bottom one, just because it'll get slip through a bit easier now. You just want to slip it through, and then it's got to go back and then locate in the right section of the shoe. And just leave it hanging there. Put the adjustment mechanism back into place. It should just slide in. Again, make sure it is adjusted to be the smallest it can be. And then we put the other shoe on. And we're going to get it in place here. And we've got to connect up the return spring at the top and this mechanism. But before we do that, what we want to do is get the smaller return spring around the bottom, because it's really easy to get on now. You can basically just put it on by hand. But if we leave it until the rest of the assembly is put together, this is a very tight spring with a lot of pressure. It's quite hard to get over. So if we just take this pad out and we link it in from the bottom, then we put the whole shooting match back together. And as we put the pad into place, it'll bring everything else into alignment. Okay, we're pretty good. So we'll get the notch in place. Then this is a bit tricky, but if I put a screwdriver behind the back pad, I can lean on it. And then with that all assembled, get some needle nose pliers in again. And then pop that return spring into place. Okay, so we slide the clip in from the bottom, up through the shoe, and retaining spring over the top. Give it some pressure. Let's see if we can turn that pin again. All right, all the way that time, perfect. So now we just need to take a look to make sure everything's seated properly. It should have a little bit of movement in it. The pins will let it shift around, but that all looks good. So I think we're okay now to put the drums on. Before I do that though, I thought it might be worthwhile to give you guys an idea of how these actually work, especially with the handbrake. So as I said, handbrake cable is here attached into the arm, and it's going to move these two brake pads apart. So I have the end of the handbrake cable here, and I can simply pull that, and you'll see the arm move. And then if we look at the other side, you'll see a corresponding movement here with this pin and this pad pushing out. So because these are one unit, by putting pressure here, it's not just going to move one pad from the handbrake, it'll actually push both out. The same way a single piston front caliper will actually put pressure on both sides of the rotor. And before you put the drums on, you just want to give them a clean with some brake clean, just that inner lining. Make sure there's no contaminants there that are going to get all over the shoes. By the way, my hands are pretty clean. I've been making sure that I clean them all the way through so I don't get oil on the friction material either. And then if you look at the outside of the drum, you've got these two holes here, which are the bolt holes that will take the drums off. So this inner diameter is going to be a very tight fit over the hub, and that's deliberate because the hub basically locates this and we want it to run true. If that was loose, you would end up with a drum that moves around and doesn't wear evenly or chatters under brakes and things like that. So it's going to be very tight. It'll probably bind up on the friction material first, which is fine because that won't be aligned, but it needs to move easily on that. So see, for that first bit, I can move it around up and down pretty easily once the drums are centered. That means that I've got the friction material in the right spot. There's a slight drag there, but we're good. And then I'm over the hub. Now to get it the rest of the way down, I'm probably going to have to use a rubber mallet, but you shouldn't have to hammer it over the friction material, just this inner hub. And that's why when you saw when I painted it, I had it masked up, so I didn't put any paint around here, and I didn't put any paint on the hub surface itself, so this all mates up true. Then we just tap these in place, just a bit at a time. All right, we're seated nicely there and the drums move without a problem. Now, once you put this into the car, what you're gonna do is hook up the handbrake and then you pull the handbrake a few times. And when you pull the handbrake a few times, it's gonna set that toothed wheel and it'll bring the friction pads out so where they're close to the drum, but not always applying pressure. So the first thing you do is when you put the diff back in the car, or once you change your drums and you put the new liners and drums on, jump in the car, activate the handbrake a few times and it will ratchet up those things to get it sitting where it needs to be so that when you do put your foot on the brakes, it's not just going to push the linings out to the point where they're not touching the drum anyway. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. The only thing that we need to do now is to get some rust converter on this and tidy it up, and then we can get some paint on it, and then we'll come back around and fit the last few items, and then we are done. So that means we've got time for just one more montage. All right, and we are done. So I've done the last few little things like fixing the hard and flexible brake lines, removing some dust caps, and a few other bits and pieces. And it looks awesome. It's not a show car by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly a good 9 out of 10. And most importantly, everything has been rebuilt and the paint is going to protect this from rust for years and years to come. So there's only a couple of things that I'm not happy with, and if you were eagle-eyed, you might have spotted the first one, and that is when I was doing the drums and I put that circlip on the back of the handbrake assembly, it looked like it had seated well when I first put it in, but then as I manipulated it, it must have come loose. And at one point I flipped the arm over and you can actually see the circlip is coming out. So I'm gonna have to pull that drum off, pull that assembly out and reseat that and make sure that it's all Mickey Mouse. The second thing is I'm not really happy with the quality of the hard lines for the braking. So I did clean them up, they just haven't cleaned up as nice as I'd like. So either way, I need to clear coat them to protect them from rust. But what I might actually do is prime them and then just give them a little bit of sort of gunmetal grey or some colour that's close to steel, because I don't want this to look gaudy, I just want it to look factory. But yeah, something that makes it look close to stock, and then we'll get them back on as well. But that stuff I'll probably just do off camera. There's no point running through it on an episode. So that just leaves us with, what are we doing next week? My plan so far is to tackle that front steering assembly. So basically we're gonna pull it down. We're gonna see a return of Frankie. She's gonna help us powder coat some parts, and then we'll get new tie rod ends in and get it reassembled, ready to go back in the car. While we're at it, there's a few other little things that I'll want to tidy up, and if I get time, I'll put the bushes into all of the control arms and things like that. But depending on how long we're going, that might be a second episode. So anyway, thanks for sticking around this far. If you're new to the channel, you should really check out the whole Violet Crumbles series. I think we're about 14 or 15 episodes in now, and you can do that with this box here. And if you want to see some episodes of the A90, just click on this box here. Other than that, like and subscribe, hit that notification bell, and thank you very much for watching The Build Room. Bye for now.